The year was 1872, and Vienna, a city renowned for its cultural vibrance, intellectual thought, and medical advancements, was on the precipice of an unprecedented enigma. A tale that would make even the most rational minds question the very nature of memory itself. In the bustling streets, where horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobbled stones, a quiet mystery was unfolding behind the walls of one of the city's most respected medical institutions. It was the story of a patient whose memories of surgeries that never took place, would forever baffle the minds of doctors and psychologists. Imagine waking up in a sterile hospital room, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air, the pain of post-surgical recovery gnawing at your body. But there is one problem. You have never had surgery. In fact, there are no medical records, no surgical incisions, nothing to suggest the operating table ever bore your form. You are not just confused, you are terrified. How could you recall something so vividly when it never happened? And yet, every detail feels so real. The surgical instruments, the faces of the doctors, the cold, metallic touch of the anesthesia mask as it was placed over your face. You remember it all in perfect clarity. And you are not alone. Countless other patients have recounted similar experiences, but none with the unsettling vividness you possess. The story begins with a simple question. How can a person remember something that never occurred? This question would grow more complex and chilling with every new layer revealed. At the heart of this mystery was not just a peculiar individual, but a puzzle that would challenge the very foundation of psychological and medical understanding in 19th-century Vienna. To understand the gravity of the situation, it is essential to consider the state of medicine in Vienna during the late 1800s. The world was teetering on the edge of the modern era, yet many aspects of medicine were still deeply rooted in ancient beliefs. The concept of the mind and memory was under intense scrutiny, with prominent figures in psychology, such as Sigmund Freud, beginning to formulate their early ideas about the unconscious. Vienna was a city on the cusp of transformation, caught between the old and the new, between the realm of mysticism and the emerging world of scientific inquiry. In a way, the city itself was a fitting backdrop for such an enigmatic case. In the medical world, particularly in psychiatry and neurology, the 19th century was a time of discovery and conflict. Traditional notions of mental illness as moral or spiritual failings were giving way to the idea that mental and emotional disorders had physical causes. Yet, despite these advancements, the field of psychiatry was still in its infancy, and the understanding of memory was rudimentary at best. Doctors were just beginning to explore how memories were formed and stored, and there were no definitive answers as to why people sometimes remembered things incorrectly or with distortion. The mind was still a vast, largely uncharted frontier. The patient at the center of this unsettling mystery was a woman whose name has been lost to history. But her case was recorded in the annals of psychiatric literature, not because she was unique in suffering from memory disturbances, but because her experience was so vivid, so detailed, and, most importantly, so insistent. She was not simply recalling a vague sense of discomfort or an ambiguous memory of a procedure. No, she recounted every single moment of the surgery in precise, unsettling detail. The sensations of the operating room, the sounds of the surgeon's voice, the cold instruments that had been used on her body. She spoke of it with such clarity that even the most experienced doctors had to stop and question their own knowledge of the human mind. Her first examination revealed something truly disturbing. There were no medical records to suggest she had undergone any surgical procedure. No scars, no surgical instruments had touched her skin, no anesthesia records. But the patient was insistent. The memory was not a hallucination. It was not a dream. She described the very room in which she had supposedly undergone the surgery, the precise people who had been present, and the details of the operation itself. Her story was consistent, even when subjected to intense scrutiny. The doctors, initially skeptical, began to search for a rational explanation. They considered the possibility that she had fabricated the entire ordeal. Perhaps she had read about surgeries or had heard stories of operations from other patients. Maybe she had created an elaborate false memory in her mind, the product of an overactive imagination. But as they dug deeper into her case, doubts began to creep in. She had no apparent motive for lying, and her level of detail was too precise to be dismissed as a mere fantasy. How could she have known things she could not have possibly learned through ordinary means? How could she have recalled smells, sounds, and sensations that had never occurred? The more the doctors examined her, the more perplexing the case became. The patient's vivid memories seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It was as though her mind had created an entire reality, an alternate history, that was as real to her as the life she had lived. And yet, there was no physical evidence to back it up. This was no ordinary case of memory distortion or confusion. This was something far more complex, and it led the doctors down a rabbit hole of psychological theories and neurological speculation. Theories about the mind and memory during this time were still in their infancy. While Freud was beginning to gain prominence with his ideas about the unconscious mind and repressed memories, mainstream psychiatry was still largely governed by older, more archaic beliefs. Hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for women with mental health issues, was still frequently used, and conditions like nervous disorders were poorly understood. The case of this patient challenged everything the medical community thought they knew about the human mind. Could the mind be so fragile that it could create entire memories of events that never took place? Could a person's recollections of their own life be so unreliable? And if that were true, what did that say about the very nature of memory itself? As doctors in Vienna struggled to make sense of the situation, the patient's condition continued to worsen. She was not just recalling the phantom surgeries in her mind. She was living them, experiencing them in her waking hours. It was as though her mind had trapped her in a loop, cycling through events that had never happened, but felt as real as the air she breathed. The gap between reality and perception was narrowing, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to discern where one ended and the other began. The case was so baffling that it eventually drew the attention of leading figures in the field of psychology. Some doctors proposed that the patient's mind had been tricked by the powerful force of suggestion. Perhaps she had seen or heard something related to surgery, and her mind, in its fragile state, had constructed a false memory around it. Others suggested that the patient was suffering from a form of delusion, where the mind creates an entire false narrative in order to cope with deep-seated emotional or psychological trauma. Yet, none of these theories fully explained the richness of the patient's recollections. What was even more unsettling was that, despite the patient's insistence that the surgeries had occurred, she showed no signs of physical trauma or psychological distress that would be expected from someone who had undergone a medical procedure. There was no sign of recovery or aftercare, no scars, no stitches. Nothing to suggest that the surgeries had ever taken place. And yet, the patient's belief in these false memories was unwavering. As the investigation into her case deepened, the unsettling reality of the situation became clear. The mind, in its most mysterious and fragile state, could construct entire false realities, memories of surgeries, of trauma, of experiences that never occurred. In this case, the mind had deceived not only the patient, but also the doctors who were meant to unravel the truth. For those studying this case, the mystery of the patient's phantom surgeries was only the beginning. The more they learned about her, the more they realized that the human mind, one of the most complex, enigmatic organs in the body, was still an unknown frontier. This case, while baffling in its specifics, was just the first of many that would challenge our understanding of memory, perception, and the very nature of reality itself. The patient who remembered surgeries that never happened would not only change the trajectory of psychiatric research, but would also force society to confront one of the most profound questions of all. How much of our memories, our very sense of self, is shaped by the mind's ability to deceive us? The year was 1872, and Vienna was a city caught between the past and the future. The streets, illuminated by gas lamps, buzzed with the energy of intellectuals, musicians, and artists who gathered in the salons and coffee houses that dotted the city. The city's architectural beauty was mirrored by the growing sense of intellectual and scientific discovery. Vienna was home to some of the brightest minds in Europe, a hub for philosophers, scientists, and physicians who were pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. But despite its outward appearance of refinement and sophistication, the city was also a place of contradiction and mystery. It was here that one of the most baffling and perplexing medical cases would unfold, one that would challenge everything the medical community thought it knew about the human mind. At the time, the world was still living in the shadow of centuries-old medical practices and superstitions. Medical knowledge had advanced in some areas, particularly in surgery and anatomy, but the study of the mind and memory was still in its infancy. Theories of mental illness were still shaped by a mix of ancient beliefs and the first stirrings of modern psychology. The medical profession was grappling with questions that remain relevant to this day. What is the nature of memory? How does the mind work? How can we trust our own perceptions of reality? In 1872, Vienna was not only the cultural capital of Europe, but also a center of medical innovation. The famous Vienna General Hospital, where groundbreaking research in various medical fields was being conducted, had recently become a focal point for the emerging field of psychiatry. The study of mental illness was slowly transitioning from mystical explanations to more scientific inquiries. But despite these advances, there were still no clear answers to many questions about the brain and its complexities. The idea that mental illness could be linked to biological processes was still in its early stages. The brain was still largely a black box, an organ whose functions were understood in rudimentary terms, if at all. Many theories about mental disorders still relied on supernatural or religious explanations, and the treatment of psychiatric patients was often cruel or ineffective. In Vienna, the most prominent name in the study of the human mind was Sigmund Freud. Although he would not come to prominence until the 1890s, Freud's early work on the unconscious mind and the role of repressed memories was already taking root in the intellectual atmosphere of the city. Freud would eventually revolutionize the field of psychology with his theories of the unconscious, but in 1872, his ideas were still emerging from the haze of speculation and debate. Vienna was a city ripe for discovery, but it was also a city with a long history of belief in the supernatural. It was the birthplace of Freudian theory, but also of mystical traditions that sought to explain the unexplainable through the language of ghosts, spirits, and divine intervention. In this atmosphere of intellectual ferment, the strange case of a patient who recalled surgeries that had never taken place was bound to send shockwaves through the medical community. The medical practitioners in Vienna in 1872 had no modern understanding of neurology or brain chemistry, but they were beginning to explore the brain's role in regulating human behavior and memory. The dominant theory of the time was still rooted in humoral theory, the idea that the balance of bodily fluids determined health and temperament. Mental illness was often linked to imbalances in the body's humors, such as excess bile or blood. The connection between the brain and mental states was acknowledged but not fully understood. Neurological disorders were often considered mysterious, their origins as inexplicable as the nature of the mind itself. Concepts such as nervous disorders or hysteria were often used to describe a wide range of symptoms without clear physical causes. The case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never occurred was not just a medical anomaly, it was a profound challenge to the entire understanding of the mind and memory at the time. How could someone remember something that had never happened? What did it mean if the mind could fabricate such detailed, convincing memories? The doctors who first encountered this case were initially skeptical. They considered the possibility that the patient was either lying or suffering from some form of delusion. But as the details of the patient's memories grew more vivid, more specific, and more convincing, even the most seasoned physicians began to question their assumptions. How could the mind produce such vivid, seemingly real memories of events that had never taken place? At the time, the idea of memory was still poorly understood. It was widely believed that memories were static, like images on a page, recorded and preserved in the brain like a photograph. The mind was thought to be a passive receptor of experiences, simply recording events and storing them away for future recall. But as the patient's memories began to defy conventional understanding, some doctors started to entertain more radical theories. Perhaps memory was not as static as they had thought. Perhaps it was more fluid, more dynamic, and more prone to distortion than anyone had imagined. Doctors began to speculate about the nature of memory itself. Was it possible that the mind could invent memories or reconstruct past events in ways that were completely detached from reality? Could the brain create vivid, elaborate memories out of thin air? Some doctors began to consider the possibility that the patient was experiencing a form of confabulation, a phenomenon in which a person's brain fills in gaps in their memory with false details. This idea was not widely accepted at the time, but it would later become an important concept in the study of memory disorders. In the 19th century, the notion that memory could be so unreliable was a deeply unsettling thought. The idea of confabulation, of the mind fabricating entire memories to fill in the blanks, was revolutionary in its implications. It suggested that memories were not fixed records of past events, but rather dynamic constructions of the mind, shaped by emotions, perceptions, and external influences. This idea would later be expanded upon by psychologists in the 20th century, but in 1872, it was still a fringe concept. At the time, many doctors still believed in the reliability of memory as a clear, accurate reflection of past events. The patient's vivid memories of surgeries that had never occurred shook this belief to its core. In Vienna's medical community, a growing sense of unease began to pervade the air. The case of the patient who remembered surgeries that had never happened was not just an isolated curiosity. It was a challenge to the very foundations of medical science. How could the mind play tricks in such a convincing way? What did it mean for our understanding of consciousness, memory, and reality? Doctors were faced with the uncomfortable possibility that the mind was far more complex and far more unreliable than they had ever imagined. The case raised profound questions about the nature of perception itself. If memory could be so easily altered or fabricated, what did that say about our ability to trust our own experiences? The patient's story would go on to become a landmark case in the history of psychiatry, a case that would influence the study of memory, delusion, and the reliability of perception for generations to come. But in 1872, Vienna's medical community was still wrestling with the basic questions of what it meant to be human. The case forced doctors to confront the limits of their knowledge and the uncertainties of the mind. It was a case that blurred the line between reality and illusion, forcing the world to reconsider what it meant to remember something. Was memory a mirror of past events, or was it a creation of the mind, shaped and molded by unseen forces? The answers to these questions would not come easily. They would require a radical shift in the way people thought about the human mind and its capacity for deception. As the mystery deepened, it became clear that the answer was not simple. The case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never occurred was not just an anomaly. It was a window into the vast, uncharted territory of the human mind. The story of this patient would remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of 19th-century medicine, a riddle that would haunt doctors, psychologists, and neuroscientists for decades to come. It was a puzzle that would challenge our understanding of the very nature of memory, consciousness, and the limits of the human mind. And, in many ways, it would set the stage for the revolution in psychiatry that was to come. The patient's first encounter with the medical professionals in Vienna was marked by confusion and uncertainty. Her story, at first, seemed to be nothing more than the ramblings of someone lost in a fog of their own mind. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about her insistence. She was not just making vague statements or having fleeting moments of confusion. No, the patient's recollections were rich with detail. She spoke with the kind of certainty that suggested these memories, however strange, had a deep-rooted conviction behind them. She was sure of what she had experienced, even though, according to every piece of medical evidence available, none of it had actually occurred. The patient, who had arrived at the hospital under the assumption that she was simply suffering from some sort of psychological disorder, soon found herself the subject of an intense and increasingly bewildering investigation. Doctors began by probing into her background, hoping to find clues that might explain the vivid memories of surgeries that she claimed to have undergone. They were faced with the same dilemma. How could someone remember something so clearly and with such specificity if it had never happened? The question seemed impossible to answer. Every detail the patient recalled, from the feel of the surgical table to the presence of specific medical instruments, was so precise, so sharply etched in her mind, that it could not easily be dismissed as a fleeting delusion or a trick of the imagination. At the heart of the doctor's confusion was the stark absence of any medical records to corroborate the patient's claims. There were no surgical documents, no notes or references to any kind of medical procedure. The patient had no physical scars or signs of recovery from surgery. Her condition was entirely unremarkable in the sense that there was no physical evidence that could support her vivid memories. The medical team at first attributed this to a case of some rare neurological disorder, but nothing about the patient's condition fit neatly into any known category. In fact, the more they probed, the more the mystery deepened. The patient, despite being adamant that she had undergone multiple surgeries, could not provide a clear explanation of when or where they had taken place. She spoke of these events in a way that suggested they were deeply embedded in her consciousness, but the passage of time had obscured specific details, like the exact date or location of the surgeries. The ambiguity surrounding these memories only added to the feeling of mystery. Was this some form of psychosis? A dissociative state brought on by trauma or stress? Or was it something far more unusual? Something that challenged the very nature of human memory itself? As the days passed, the doctors began to notice a strange pattern in the patient's behavior. Each time they pressed her for more details, she became increasingly agitated. It was not just a simple case of confusion. It was as if the patient's mind was rejecting the idea that these surgeries had not occurred. Her insistence seemed to grow stronger with each conversation, and as time went on, it was clear that she was becoming more deeply entangled in the web of her own memories. There was no room for doubt in her mind. The surgeries had happened, and there was nothing that could convince her otherwise. Doctors began to consider that the patient might be suffering from a dissociative disorder, where the mind creates alternative realities in order to cope with trauma. In this context, the surgeries she remembered could have been her mind's way of coping with some deeper emotional or psychological injury. But even this theory felt insufficient. The vividness of her memories seemed too specific, too detailed, to be the product of mere imagination. The patient described the instruments that had been used on her during the surgeries, tools that were not typically discussed in medical literature and certainly not commonly found in the minds of everyday people. She described their texture, the sound they made when they were set on the sterile surgical table, the cold sensation as they made contact with her skin. How could she have known these things if she had never actually been under the knife? The medical team also noted that the patient's physical health seemed unremarkable. There were no signs of trauma, no lingering effects of surgery, and yet her mind seemed to have constructed a completely coherent narrative of events that had never occurred. Could it be possible that the mind, in its complexity, was capable of fabricating entire experiences, complete with sensations, sounds, and even emotions that seemed indistinguishable from real memories? This concept seemed almost too unsettling to consider, but the more the doctors examined the case, the more it appeared to be the only explanation that could begin to make sense of the situation. One of the more perplexing aspects of the case was the way the patient spoke of the surgeons and medical staff involved in her surgeries. She had never met any of these people before, and yet she was able to recall with startling accuracy their faces, their voices, even the specific words they had said to her during the procedures. She described the temperature of the operating room, the distinct odor of antiseptic, and the feeling of the anesthesia mask being placed over her face, details so vivid that they could only have been formed by someone who had actually been in the operating room. But the records showed that none of these surgeries had ever taken place. The medical professionals who worked at the hospital were baffled. Had the patient somehow gained this knowledge from overhearing conversations or from external sources? Or had her mind simply constructed these details out of nothing? As the investigation into her case deepened, the doctors started to test her memory more rigorously. They attempted to use various techniques to unlock more information and perhaps reveal the source of her false memories. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was that the more the doctors tried to probe the patient's memories, the more detailed and specific the memories became. She did not just remember abstract sensations, she recalled specific conversations, precise moments during the surgeries, even the exact number of stitches that had been used in an operation that never took place. Every detail was rendered with such clarity that it was almost impossible for the doctors to dismiss it as mere fantasy or delusion. At first, the medical team considered the possibility that the patient might have been influenced by external factors, perhaps a suggestion planted in her mind through a casual conversation or through reading material she had come across. But this theory began to unravel as the patient's memories grew more specific and more accurate in their detail. It was as if her mind had constructed an entirely new reality for her, one that she had come to accept as true, despite the glaring contradictions with the objective facts of her medical history. The psychological theories of the time offered few answers. There was little understanding of the brain's complex role in memory formation, and even less comprehension of how the mind might fabricate entire memories out of thin air. The patient's case was a direct challenge to the conventional understanding of memory as a reliable record of past events. What was memory, if not a faithful record of the past? And if the mind could fabricate memories, then how could anyone trust their own recollections of events? The case raised troubling questions about the nature of reality itself. As the doctors continued to investigate the patient's case, they found themselves confronted by more and more mysteries. Was she suffering from some form of extreme psychological trauma? Was her mind constructing false memories to protect her from some repressed trauma or deep-seated emotional pain? Or was there something else at play, something more mysterious and far-reaching than anyone could comprehend? The more the doctors tried to unravel the mystery, the more elusive the answers became. It was clear that they were dealing with something far outside the bounds of conventional medical understanding. The case quickly gained the attention of leading figures in the field of psychiatry, but even the brightest minds of the time were unable to offer a satisfactory explanation. Theories of dissociation, repressed memories, and neurosis were all considered, but none could fully account for the bizarre, detailed nature of the patient's memories. As the case continued, the line between what was real and what was imagined began to blur, and the question remained: was the patient suffering from a mental disorder, or had she uncovered a deeper mystery about the human mind, one that even the most advanced medical minds of the time were ill-equipped to understand? As the days went by and the medical team continued to investigate the case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never happened, their initial skepticism began to shift toward doubt. What had initially seemed like an isolated, albeit strange, incident now appeared to be a deeper and more complex psychological enigma. The more they observed the patient's behavior, the more they realized that her case was not just one of simple memory distortion, as they had hoped at first. It was not merely a matter of confusion or a momentary lapse in mental clarity. The patient's memories, her vivid sensory recollections of surgical procedures, were not the result of a fleeting delusion or a misinterpretation of events. No, they seemed to be the product of a mind that was working in ways no one understood, creating a false reality so convincing that even the most experienced doctors were finding it difficult to dismiss. There was a palpable tension among the medical staff as they grappled with the profound implications of the case. Their collective knowledge of psychology, which at the time was still relatively rudimentary, offered little insight into the patient's strange condition. The prevailing medical views of memory and mental illness in 1872 were still largely rooted in the ideas of ancient humoral theory and the concept of hysteria, which was often applied to women with mental health issues. The idea that the mind could fabricate entire memories, and that these fabricated memories could feel as real as genuine experiences, was a foreign and unsettling concept. The patient's case seemed to defy every medical explanation they had at their disposal. The first theory they considered was that of hysteria, a diagnosis often used in the 19th century to explain unexplained psychological symptoms, especially in women. Hysteria, in its broadest sense, was understood as a condition where the emotional or mental state of an individual caused them to experience physical symptoms that had no clear organic cause. It was often associated with a wide range of symptoms, from physical paralysis to fainting, and in some cases, it was thought to manifest in the form of false memories or delusions. Given that the patient was a woman, the doctors quickly turned to this theory as a possible explanation for her vivid recollections of surgeries that had never taken place. However, as they delved deeper into her case, they began to see cracks in this explanation. The patient's memories were too detailed and consistent for them to be easily attributed to the kind of vague, non-specific symptoms often associated with hysteria. One of the most compelling aspects of the case was the specificity with which the patient described the surgeries. She did not just recall a vague sense of having undergone a procedure. She recounted precise, sensory details of the operations. She could describe the medical instruments with stunning accuracy, mentioning tools that were rarely seen outside of specific medical contexts. She spoke of the coldness of the surgical table, the feeling of the anesthesia mask being placed over her face, and the sounds of the surgical team working in the sterile environment of the operating room. These were not the types of details that someone with a generalized mental health disorder or hysteria would likely fabricate. They suggested a far more intricate mental process, one that created a memory so vivid that it could not be easily dismissed as an episode of hysteria or emotional distress. As the patient's memories grew more detailed, the doctors began to question whether they were dealing with something more than just a mental disorder. Could it be that the patient was suffering from a form of psychological trauma? Theories of trauma, particularly repressed memories, were beginning to gain traction among psychologists of the time, though they were still in their infancy. The idea that the mind could bury painful or disturbing memories in the unconscious, only for them to resurface later in distorted or altered forms, was a novel concept in 1872. This theory seemed to offer some potential explanation for the patient's vivid memories. Could it be that the surgeries were traumatic experiences that had been repressed in her mind, only to resurface years later in the form of false memories? But this theory, too, seemed to fall short. The patient showed no signs of trauma in her medical history, no evidence of physical harm, or any event that could have triggered such repressed memories. She was not suffering from the kind of emotional distress that would typically accompany a traumatic event. And more importantly, the memories were so specific, so detailed, that it was difficult to believe they could be the result of a repressed experience. Trauma, after all, is often remembered as a vague, fragmented experience, not as a series of precise, sensory recollections. The fact that the patient could recount every detail of the surgeries, down to the smell of the antiseptic and the feeling of the surgical instruments, made the theory of repressed memories increasingly untenable. At this point, the medical team began to look beyond the conventional theories of the time and explore more radical explanations. They turned to the emerging field of psychology, particularly the work of early theorists like William James, who was beginning to suggest that memory was not as simple as a passive recording of events. James, among others, was hinting at the idea that memory might be far more complex and fluid than previously thought. Could the mind, as James proposed, be capable of constructing memories that were not based on reality, but rather on the mind's own internal workings? Could the patient's memories of surgeries be the product of her brain's attempt to make sense of her experiences, regardless of whether they were grounded in reality? Theories like this, though still in their infancy, seemed to offer a better explanation for the patient's condition. Perhaps her mind had created these memories as a form of psychological defense or compensation. In some ways, the mind might have constructed an entire narrative of events, an elaborate story that fit the emotional needs of the patient, even if those events had never actually occurred. If the brain could create false memories of events that had never happened, then what was the true nature of memory? Was memory simply a record of events, or was it an active, creative process that could manipulate the past to serve the needs of the present? As the doctors continued to probe deeper into the patient's case, they began to look for signs that her condition might be related to something more than just memory distortion. They considered the possibility that the patient was experiencing a form of dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism in which the mind separates itself from painful experiences or emotions. Dissociation, as an explanation for the patient's memories, seemed plausible. If the patient had experienced some sort of emotional or psychological distress, her mind might have created an entirely separate reality to shield her from the pain. In this case, the surgeries she remembered could have been a way for her mind to process some deeper trauma or emotional conflict, even though the events themselves were entirely fictional. The theory of dissociation was not widely accepted at the time, but it began to gain ground as the doctors continued to observe the patient. She seemed to be detached from reality in some ways. Her memories of the surgeries were so vivid and so insistent that it was as though they were more real to her than the actual events of her life. This emotional detachment coupled with the specific and consistent details of her memories, suggested that her mind had created an entirely fabricated reality in which the surgeries were real. The patient's insistence on the truth of her memories, despite all evidence to the contrary, only reinforced the idea that her mind had separated these fabricated memories from the rest of her consciousness. As the weeks passed, the doctors found themselves confronting a growing sense of unease. What they were witnessing was not just a rare mental disorder. It was something far more profound and disconcerting. The case was no longer just a medical anomaly. It was a window into the very nature of memory itself. If the mind could create memories so vivid and detailed that they felt as real as actual experiences, then what did that mean for the reliability of memory? Could anyone truly trust their memories, or were they subject to the same distortions and fabrications that the patient was experiencing? The mystery deepened, and the answers seemed increasingly elusive. The more the doctors explored the patient's memories, the more they realized that the case was not just about one woman's psychological state. It was a larger, more troubling question about the nature of the human mind and its capacity for deception. If memory could be so easily manipulated and distorted, what did that say about the very foundation of human experience? Could the mind be trusted at all? These were questions that would linger long after the patient's case had been concluded, questions that would inspire future generations of psychologists and neurologists to continue exploring the limits and complexities of human memory. The case, though perplexing and unresolved, would leave an indelible mark on the field of psychiatry, challenging conventional notions of memory and reality. As the investigation into the case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never happened unfolded, the medical team was faced with a growing sense of bewilderment and unease. With each new development, the case seemed to shift further away from the realm of the familiar and into something far more mysterious. The more the doctors delved into the patient's memories, the more complex the puzzle became. It was no longer just a matter of a woman experiencing unusual recollections. It had become a profound question about the nature of memory itself and the very fabric of human consciousness. The patient, for her part, remained insistent on the truth of her memories. No amount of questioning or suggestion could shake her belief that she had undergone multiple surgeries. She described the procedures with an unsettling level of detail. She recalled not only the general experience of being on the operating table, but also the minute sensations, the cold steel of the surgical instruments, the specific voices of the medical staff, the distinct smells of the operating room. These were not the fragmented recollections of someone suffering from confusion or hysteria. These were vivid, fully formed memories that, to the patient, felt no different from the memories of her everyday life. And yet, there was no physical evidence to support her claims. No scars, no surgical records, no anesthesia logs, nothing to indicate that these events had ever taken place. This contradiction was at the heart of the mystery. The patient's memories were so detailed, so convincing, that they could not easily be dismissed as the product of a fevered imagination or a fleeting mental lapse. And yet, the lack of any physical evidence to support these memories created a gap that seemed impossible to bridge. If the surgeries had truly occurred, why was there no trace of them? Could the mind be capable of inventing entire memories so thoroughly that they could fool not only the person experiencing them, but also the trained medical professionals trying to understand them? To answer this question, the doctors began to explore more deeply the nature of memory itself. The conventional wisdom of the time held that memory was a passive process, one in which events were recorded and stored in the brain, much like photographs in an album. When a person recalled a memory, they were simply retrieving a mental image of a past event. This understanding of memory was simplistic, and it did not account for the complexities that were beginning to emerge in the patient's case. What was becoming increasingly clear was that the patient's memories were not like the simple, straightforward recollections one might expect. They were constructed memories, images, and sensations that had been created by the mind, not from actual experiences, but from something more elusive. The notion that memory might not be a fixed, reliable record of events was a radical one. At the time, many in the medical community believed that memory was an accurate and faithful reflection of reality. If someone remembered something, it was assumed that it had truly happened. But the patient's case forced doctors to reconsider this assumption. Could it be possible that the mind could fabricate entire memories that felt just as real as actual events? Was memory more fluid, more malleable, than anyone had ever realized? These questions were not just academic. They had profound implications for how people understood their own lives and the world around them. As the doctors examined the patient more closely, they began to explore the possibility that her memories were the result of a psychological process known as confabulation. Confabulation, a term that would later become central to the field of neuropsychology, refers to the act of creating false memories without the intention to deceive. In a sense, the mind fills in the gaps when it encounters missing or incomplete information, sometimes creating entirely fabricated details that feel just as real as true memories. While confabulation is often associated with brain injuries or certain neurological conditions, the patient's case seemed to suggest that it could also be a psychological defense mechanism. If the patient had experienced some kind of trauma, something too painful to consciously process, her mind may have created false memories of the surgeries as a way of coping with that distress. This theory, however, did not fully account for the incredible precision with which the patient described the surgical procedures. Her memories were not vague or abstract. They were complete and detailed, down to the smallest sensations and sounds. This level of specificity suggested that the patient's mind had not merely filled in the blanks, but had created an entirely new, coherent narrative, one that felt as real as the events of her actual life. Could the mind be so powerful that it could generate entire, fully formed memories out of nothing? And if so, what did that say about the reliability of memory in general? The patient's insistence on the reality of her memories created a strange tension in the room. The medical team had become divided. Some of the doctors were still convinced that the patient's memories were a product of psychological distress or hysteria. They clung to the belief that the mind, in its fragile state, was capable of inventing elaborate stories to make sense of confusion or trauma. But others, increasingly unsettled by the patient's vivid recollections, began to entertain more radical ideas. Perhaps the mind was not simply a passive recorder of events, but an active creator, constantly reconstructing and reshaping the past in ways that were beyond conscious control. The idea that memory could be so unreliable had profound implications. If the mind was capable of creating entirely false memories, then how could anyone be certain of their own recollections? Could a person trust their memories of their own life? Could the mind be trusted at all? These questions were deeply unsettling because they challenged the very foundation of personal identity. If our memories were not reliable, then who were we? How could we define ourselves if the very experiences that formed the basis of our identities could be fabricated or distorted by the mind? The case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never happened was not just an isolated anomaly, it was a fundamental challenge to the idea of selfhood, to the very notion of what it meant to be a person. As the investigation continued, the doctors tried to look for any external clues that might shed light on the mystery. They scoured the patient's personal history, searching for any signs that could explain the vividness of her memories. Did she have a history of traumatic experiences? Was there anything in her past that might have triggered the creation of these false memories? But the patient's life, as far as they could tell, was unremarkable. She had no history of mental illness, no significant traumas that might explain the vividness of her memories. In fact, her life seemed almost too ordinary, too free of the kinds of emotional or psychological stresses that might explain such an intense, fabricated recollection. The lack of any obvious trigger made the case even more perplexing. If the patient had no clear emotional trauma to draw upon, then what had led her mind to create these detailed, elaborate memories of surgeries that never took place? And why had she clung to them so fiercely? It was as if the patient's mind had constructed a reality in which these events had occurred, and she was unwilling or unable to let go of that reality. This refusal to abandon the memories, despite all evidence to the contrary, suggested something more than simple confusion or a psychological defense. It was as though the patient's mind had locked onto these false memories and had made them an essential part of her identity. In some strange way, these fabricated memories had become as real to her as the memories of her actual life. As the weeks turned into months, The case continued to haunt the doctors. They were no closer to understanding the true nature of the patient's memories. But what they did understand was that this case was not just an isolated incident. It was a window into the complexity of the human mind, a mind that could create entire realities, memories of events that had never occurred, sensations that had never been felt, and experiences that had never been lived. The case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never happened forced the doctors to confront the possibility that the mind was far more complex and far more unreliable than they had ever imagined. In many ways, the case marked a turning point in the history of psychology and psychiatry. It forced the medical community to rethink its assumptions about memory, perception, and the nature of reality. If the mind could create false memories with such clarity and detail, then what did that mean for the field of medicine? Could doctors truly rely on memory as a tool for diagnosis or treatment? And if memory could be so easily manipulated, what did that say about the nature of personal identity and the self? These questions would linger long after the patient's case had faded from the headlines, challenging the very foundation of how people understood themselves and their place in the world. The case, in the end, was never fully resolved. There were no definitive answers, only more questions. But what it did offer was a glimpse into the vast, unexplored terrain of the human mind, a mind that could deceive, create, and shape reality in ways that even the most experienced doctors of the time could not understand. The patient who remembered surgeries that never happened may have disappeared into the annals of medical history, but her case left an indelible mark on the field, a reminder of how little we truly know about the mind and its mysterious workings. As the case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never happened continued to unfold, the doctors became increasingly aware that they were grappling with something far beyond the scope of their training and knowledge. The more they investigated, the deeper they plunged into the complexities of human memory, consciousness, and identity, areas that were still largely uncharted in 1872. What had begun as a peculiar case of apparent delusion now seemed to touch upon the very core of what it meant to be human, to experience life, and to remember those experiences. The patient's memories of surgeries, though false in reality, felt real to her in every possible way. It was not just that she claimed to have undergone procedures that had never occurred. She spoke of them as though they were as tangible and undeniable as any event she had actually lived through. The sensations were as vivid as those of a real memory: the coldness of the surgical table, the faint sound of a scalpel scraping against skin, the smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils as she was wheeled into the operating room. Each of these details felt so immediate, so rooted in reality, that it was impossible for the patient to entertain the possibility that they were imagined. In her mind, these surgeries had happened. They were an undeniable part of her past. The medical professionals in Vienna, however, were growing more and more perplexed. The lack of any physical evidence to support her memories, no scars, no surgical records, no witness accounts, seemed to indicate that these events could not possibly have occurred. And yet, the patient's insistence on their authenticity seemed to have a power all its own. It was as if her mind had created a completely separate reality, one in which these fabricated events had taken place, and the patient could not be convinced otherwise. This was not simply a case of someone with a faulty memory. This was something altogether more troubling and more elusive. A case in which the mind had created a narrative so vivid, so convincing, that it had become indistinguishable from the truth. As the doctors probed deeper into the psychological aspects of the case, they began to consider the possibility that the patient was not suffering from a delusion, but rather from a profound and complex form of what would later be understood as dissociative amnesia or confabulation. Dissociative amnesia, a disorder that involves gaps in memory, typically associated with a traumatic event, could explain how the patient might have experienced a sudden, temporary memory loss or blackout. But the patient's memories of these non-existent surgeries were far more than simple gaps. They were full, complete, and rich in detail. This suggested that the mind was not merely filling in blanks in her memory, but constructing an entire reality from the ground up. The more the doctors considered this, the more they began to question their assumptions about memory itself. Memory, after all, was something that everyone took for granted. It was presumed to be a reliable recording of past experiences, stored away in the brain like pages in a book. When we recalled a memory, we were simply accessing a factual record of an event. But the patient's case suggested something very different. Perhaps memory was not a passive record of events, but an active process, one that could be shaped, distorted, and even fabricated by the mind in ways that were beyond our conscious control. What the patient's case seemed to reveal was that the mind was not a simple recorder, but a highly complex and creative organ capable of generating entire, false realities. This was a profound realization that turned everything the medical community understood about memory on its head. If memories could be fabricated so thoroughly, how could anyone be certain that their own memories were trustworthy? Were all memories, those of ordinary people and even doctors, susceptible to similar distortions? This uncertainty about memory's reliability had far-reaching implications, not only for the field of psychiatry, but for the very nature of personal identity itself. Memory, after all, is more than just a collection of facts about past events. It is intimately tied to our sense of self, to who we believe ourselves to be. Our memories create the narrative of our lives, shaping our identities and giving us a sense of continuity over time. If the mind was capable of inventing entire memories that felt as real as actual events, then the question of personal identity became far more complicated. Who are we if our memories, our most fundamental sense of self, are unreliable? How do we define who we are if the mind can construct false memories that feel indistinguishable from reality? These were the kinds of questions that began to haunt the medical team. And while the answers were not readily forthcoming, the case itself became a springboard for deeper inquiries into the workings of the mind. For the doctors, the mystery of the patient's memories was not just a diagnostic puzzle. It was a philosophical and existential dilemma. If the mind could so easily create false memories, then how could anyone trust their own perception of reality? Could the mind be trusted at all? Could anyone truly know themselves if the very memories that constituted their self-identity were open to distortion and manipulation? The search for answers led the doctors to delve deeper into the emerging field of psychology, particularly into theories of the unconscious mind. Freud, who would later revolutionize the study of human behavior with his theories of the unconscious, had not yet risen to prominence in 1872, but his ideas were slowly beginning to take root in Vienna's intellectual climate. Freud believed that the unconscious mind played a central role in shaping human behavior, and that repressed memories or desires could emerge into consciousness in disguised forms. Although Freud's work was still in its early stages, his theories would eventually provide a framework for understanding many of the phenomena observed in the patient's case. At the time, however, the concept of repressed memory was still largely speculative. The idea that the mind could create entirely false memories to protect itself from painful or traumatic experiences was not yet fully understood. Still, the medical team was beginning to consider that the patient's fabricated memories might be an unconscious attempt to make sense of some deeper, unacknowledged truth. Could these false memories of surgery be an allegory or metaphor for something deeper in the patient's mind, a way of processing an emotional or psychological wound that she had not yet fully confronted? This line of thinking was in its infancy, but it pointed to the possibility that the patient's mind had created an entirely new reality as a form of coping with something far more complex and buried. In many ways, the patient's case was ahead of its time. It foreshadowed a revolution in psychology that would not take full form until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As the medical team continued their investigation, they were becoming increasingly aware that the case was not just an isolated incident, but a glimpse into a much broader and more profound mystery. The mystery of how the mind works and how it constructs the reality in which we live. They were beginning to realize that memory itself was far more malleable than anyone had previously imagined. But even as they explored these new ideas, the doctors remained cautious. Theories of the unconscious mind and repressed memories were still speculative, and the understanding of the mind's complexities had not yet reached the level it would in the coming decades. The patient's case, for all its intrigue, was still an enigma, and the answers seemed as elusive as ever. Despite their best efforts, The medical team could not definitively explain why the patient's memories of surgeries that had never occurred were so vivid, so compelling, and so completely real to her. What they could say, however, was that this case had forced them to confront some of the most fundamental questions in the history of psychiatry. It had challenged their understanding of memory, perception, and identity, and it had pointed toward a new, uncharted territory in the study of the mind, one in which memory could no longer be seen as a simple recording of the past, but as a dynamic, creative force capable of shaping our perceptions of reality in ways that were still not fully understood. The case of the patient who remembered surgeries that never happened would become a touchstone for future investigations into the nature of memory, consciousness, and the limits of human understanding. Though the patient's case may have faded from the public eye, the questions it raised remained. The implications of her experiences would ripple through the future of psychology and psychiatry, prompting further inquiry into the very nature of the human mind. How far could the mind stretch the boundaries of reality? What did it mean for our understanding of ourselves if the very memories that defined our personal histories could be distorted or invented entirely? These were the questions that the patient's case left behind, haunting not only the doctors who had investigated it, but also future generations who would continue the search for answers to the most elusive and profound mysteries of the human mind. As the medical investigation into the case continued, the patient's memories became a subject of intense scrutiny, not only by the medical team in Vienna, but also by other experts from across the country. The case had reached beyond the walls of the hospital, becoming something of a fascination among the medical community, who were both baffled and intrigued by the extent of the woman's claims. The question was no longer just about the surgeries she described, but about the very nature of memory and reality itself. How could the mind create such vivid, sensory-filled memories of events that had never taken place? Was there a deeper psychological process at work, one that was beyond the understanding of 19th-century medicine? With each new piece of evidence, or lack thereof, the mystery only deepened. The doctors began to observe the patient more closely, watching her responses with a growing sense of unease. They noted her unwavering conviction in her memories of the surgeries, and the more they tried to challenge her, the more firmly she held on to her version of events. There was something compelling about her belief, something almost persuasive, that made it difficult for anyone to dismiss her as a mere delusional case. It was as though the patient had woven an alternate reality in which these surgeries were a part of her life, and no amount of questioning or contradiction could unravel it. What became apparent, as the days stretched into weeks, was that the patient was not just recalling vague impressions of past events. She described the surgeries with such precision, such specific details, that it was impossible to ignore the overwhelming consistency in her accounts. She spoke of the instruments that had been used, tools that were seldom discussed in common medical discourse, but were known to be part of more specialized procedures. She recalled the exact position of the surgical table, the order in which the staff moved about the room, and even the tone of their voices. These memories were far more than simple fragments or fleeting impressions. They were detailed and grounded in the sensory aspects of her experience. There were moments when she would even pause to describe the subtle, often imperceptible sensations she had felt during the procedures, such as the slight pressure of a scalpel on her skin or the warmth of the anesthesia flowing through her veins. The precision with which she described these events forced the medical team to confront an unsettling reality. It was difficult to explain how she could possess such an intricate memory of events that had never occurred. The absence of physical evidence, no scars, no surgical records, no witnesses, suggested that the surgeries never took place. And yet, the clarity of the patient's memories seemed undeniable. Could the mind really be capable of creating such vivid, sensory experiences from nothing? Was it possible for a person to construct a reality so compelling that it could fool the mind into believing that a fabrication was real? The medical team was forced to reconsider their understanding of memory and perception. It was clear that something deeper was at play, something more intricate than the simple processes they had been trained to recognize. Memory, as they had always understood it, was supposed to be a passive process, one in which the brain simply recorded and stored information about past events. But the patient's case suggested that memory could be far more active, more creative than they had ever imagined. Could the mind, under certain circumstances, create entire memories out of nothing, memories that were so detailed and lifelike that they became indistinguishable from actual experiences. This idea was so radical that it forced the medical professionals to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the mind. At the same time, the doctors began to look more closely at the psychological state of the patient. Could her memories be the result of some kind of unresolved trauma or emotional distress? The theory of repressed memory was still in its infancy in 1872, but it offered a potential explanation for the patient's condition. If her mind had repressed some deeply traumatic experience, something too painful to confront directly, could it have manifested in the form of these false memories? The theory, although speculative, suggested the patient might have created these detailed memories of surgeries as a coping mechanism, a way to displace or reframe the trauma into something that felt manageable. However, this theory also raised more questions than answers. For one, there was no clear evidence of any underlying trauma in the patient's life. Her personal history, as far as the doctors could tell, was unremarkable. She had not experienced any significant physical or emotional trauma that would have prompted the creation of such vivid, complex memories. If her mind had indeed created these false memories as a response to a hidden emotional wound, then what did that say about the psychological processes involved? Was the mind capable of generating an entirely false reality to replace or obscure painful memories? And if so, how did it do so with such precision and detail? As the investigation deepened, the doctors turned their attention to the emerging field of psychiatry and neurology. At the time, the medical understanding of the brain and its functions was still rudimentary. Theories about the mind were still largely based on philosophical ideas rather than scientific evidence. However, there were emerging theories, such as those proposed by the early works of figures like Sigmund Freud and William James, that began to challenge the traditional understanding of the mind. Freud's ideas about the unconscious mind and repressed memories were still in their infancy, but they provided a potential framework for understanding what might be happening to the patient. According to Freud, repressed memories could emerge in distorted forms, disguised as symbolic representations of the original trauma. Perhaps in the case of this patient, her memories of surgeries were not literal, but symbolic representations of something much deeper and more hidden in her psyche. This theory, though still speculative and untested, suggested that the mind was capable of constructing entire realities, false memories that served as a defense mechanism against something far more painful or traumatic. The idea that the mind could produce such vivid, intricate memories was both fascinating and terrifying. It implied that memory, rather than being a reliable record of past events, was far more malleable and susceptible to distortion than anyone had realized. If memories could be so easily fabricated, then how could anyone truly trust their own recollections? How could they be certain that their own experiences, the very foundation of their identity, were not subject to the same distortions? As the patient's case drew more attention, the medical team found themselves at the center of an intellectual debate. On one side, there were those who believed that the patient's memories were the result of a psychological disorder, a manifestation of the mind's capacity to distort and invent. On the other side, there were those who began to question the entire concept of memory itself. Could the mind, under certain circumstances, create entire memories from nothing? And if so, what did that mean for our understanding of reality? The debate grew more heated as the case continued, and the questions surrounding it began to ripple out beyond the confines of the hospital walls.